All
Oh
right.
God.
Hello, everybody. This is Tripp, and I am here with two good friends, super mega nerds, Jeffrey Pugh and Adam Clark, who recently did reading groups with Homebrewed Christianity on Black theology, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and for some reason, if we thought they were timely earlier this year, we thought, what high quality 2020 reading groups, like it could really inspire, help us reflect, engage actively, prophetically. Then 2021 happened and was like, you know, I would say hold my beer, but I don't want to associate beer with derogatory experiences. So here we are. I got a stack of questions from people that have been in reading groups, many of them, both of them. Um, but I want to kick things off with giving you each a time to share what's going through your head, how you would contextualize the work we read, the conversations we had in the group, to what's going on now. But first, I just want to give a shout out to Omar, Homebrewed Christianity deacon, who is joining us. He is in the hospital with COVID right now. So for all of you that pray, for those that are processed, that attend to the lure of God, for those that just like to send energy or whatever, theopoetic way you render the source of all existence, attending positively to my dear friend Omar, you can do that. I know there are plenty of others who are struggling in this moment in other ways. And while we're going to have fun, we're going to get nerdy, we'll get serious. I don't want our friendship and jovial nerding to a difficult situation to minimize any particular person's pain or struggle in this moment. Um, this is simultaneously hoping to process it with the gifts of some amazing thinkers like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and James Cone, but also it's a chance to know that you're in the company of people who take those voices seriously and their faith seriously. So that's kind of my goal for the evening, is to be nerdy friends with a group of nerdy friends that had been in reading groups, and to be serious about this moment, but also to go, yeah, let's also try attempt to be human and lead into that together. So yeah, so well, let Jeff go first, since the Bonhoeffer group was the first one we did, and he has more catching up to do. um the like Trump just kept leveling up the whole time during the Black theology class. It was like stuff. If you had thought the first time I read James Cone, I'm like, wow, that's a little edgy, I don't know if it'd go that far. By the time you're reading with Donald Trump, you're like, James, you're so conservative here. Are you sure? You just might need to turn the knob up. So that I'll mute myself. Let Dr. Pugh come in. Then Adam and I can ask him a few questions, and we'll let Dr. Clark jump in. And then I got all y'all's questions. Feel free to send them on social media or in the chat here if you're on Zoom or Facebook. So there you go. Dr. Pugh, theologize for whatever amount of time, your theological wick is burning.
Okay, well, just real quickly, white people lost their shit. They're terrified. They're terrified of losing power. They don't know what to do about it. They see that the society in front of them is changing in significant ways, and they just don't know what to do about it. So I want to go back to Bonhoeffer for just a second. Well, maybe more in a second. This is not Germany in 1933. It's a completely different situation. Our democracy is stronger than Germany's was in 1933, hopefully. The conditions and the situation is very much different. Now, that said, there are family resemblances to authoritarian leaders who try to gain power through self-coups or through inspiring a coup. And if there's any parallel or similarity to 1933, you could say that January the 6th was America's Reichstag fire, the attempt at America's Reichstag fire. You could have seen that going very much differently. I know it's so strange to actually be saying these words, but if the goal was in fact to kill Mike Pence and Nancy Pelosi so that the succession level was cleared and Trump had to declare martial law and suspend the Constitution, you could have seen that possibility. I don't think we should discount that possibility, and then we would have been in a Reichstag fire moment. Laws could have been passed that would have given Trump enormous powers like the enabling laws were in Germany in 1933. So I know that even as I say those words, many of the hearers of this are going to go, oh, that's just impossible. But in fact, it's not impossible, because historically it has happened where rulers have gained power through just such events as took place in this country in January the 6th. Now, that's one thing I want to say. We did evade a kind of similarity to a precipitating event that could have led to a more dire situation. I don't think personally that we're out of the woods on that yet, but we'll have to see. And I just want to say that for those of us who were on the line in Charlottesville, this event on January the 6th was not necessarily a surprise. What I think the surprise is going to be is when we find out how well coordinated it was. I think that will be the surprise. But I've seen those people before. Those people were in Charlottesville on August 12th, 2017. And they're going to represent an ongoing danger to American society. Now, saying that, I want to say something about the support that those people on January the 6th had, and it could not escape anybody's attention that the number of Trump flags was probably rivaled by, if not surpassed by, the number of Jesus flags. So as we look at our country and we look going forward to the future, the reality of Christian nationalism and what it represents to American society, that cannot be diminished either. White supremacists legitimate and condone their particular actions by divine warrant. And once you've justified anything in the name of God, then you're home free. You know, that means that an act of piety or an act of murder can be transmuted into an act of piety. So I think that that's something that, as we go forward in the conversation this evening, we're going to have to recognize. Fortunately, there are a number of voices that are coming out with books. Jesus and John Wayne, which is getting a lot of attention these days. And I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, Kristen Dumais. And then Andrew Whitehead has come out with a book on Christian nationalism. So this is a dynamic that is being treated now with, I think, a great deal of seriousness. And going forward, it will be treated with a great deal of seriousness. And I guess the great irony is that if America were to fall, which admittedly is a mixed bag, if America were to fall, then Christians would be at the heart of it. They will have been at the heart of the justification and legitimation of absolute rebellion. That also was the case in Nazi Germany in 1933. The Deutsche Christian, for those of you who remember what we were talking about in the summer, hardcore Christian groups supported Hitler right through the bunker. And the vast majority of Christians, because of their the sort of implicit anti-Semitism that Christianity brought into its European forms, you know, that also was a response to a perceived other. Just as when we start to think about, and Adam can unpack this more later, the perceived other here, the thing that must be eradicated, the thing that must be defeated, is not just pluralism, but it is the desire to hang on to whiteness, to the whiteness, it is able to determine what a society looks like, who owns power, who controls bodies, and the fear of losing that power that drove much of the chaos on Monday. I'm going to go ahead and stop there, because I think that to sort of reiterate my points, we came close. It's a family resemblance to things that have happened in history with dire results. And Christianity is going to stand. Eric McTaxis is going to wonder why he's being persecuted. And he's being persecuted for all the right reasons. He's not being persecuted for calling out the empire. He's not being persecuted for offering a way of resistance to the destruction of humanity. He's being persecuted because he rejected the way of Jesus and has followed the idols of political power. Yeah, I just did that. So we can talk about that going forward, but I'll just stop there.
Yeah, that was strong. Let me ask you this question. Well, two things that emerged as you spoke. One, it's about kind of comparisons between the American situation and the European situation. Many people, when we talk about Germany in the 1920s and 30s of the United States, they see it as hyperbole, right? Like when people mention how Hitler was a product of a failed coup attempt, I think it was 1923 or something like that he became dictator. They think that that's being hyperbolic. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that. That's the first question, in terms of people just dismissing that type of language altogether. And secondly, related, is the idea of when people think of fascism, they think of it as a European phenomenon. And what would an American fascism look like? What would be kind of the scaffolding, the architecture of that would look like in relationship to what we just saw?
Two very good questions. The first one I feel like I can answer. The second one, probably Timothy Snyder, historian who's been showing up a lot and wrote the book on tyranny right at the beginning of the Trump administration. But let me go back to your first question about the hyperbole part. I think one of the reasons that we use that word hyperbole is because Hitler has become our fetish of evil. He has become the absolute embodiment of evil. So that anything that doesn't rise to that level is manageable, say, or not as much of a existential threat. So because we fetishize Hitler as the sort of absoluteness of evil, then any time we try to make a parallel or try to draw out a kind of okay, well this is, maybe there's things going on. People will say, well, that's just hyperbolic. We're not gonna start putting people in concentration camps. Really? Tell it to the kids in cages on the border. We're not going to start, gassing Jewish people. Really? Once you give a sociopath power, no matter what their last name is, they'll keep taking more power until they're stopped. They won't stop until they can't go any further. And so when we think about that notion or that idea, when Hitler got his start, he wasn't Hitler. He was just some doofus politician that they thought they were going to be able to control so that they would be able to maintain power. And Hitler then becomes Hitler later on with subsequent events, and becomes not only the Hitler of our imagination, but the Hitler of reality. So, there's no telling the capabilities of human beings when they're given vast, unimaginable power without a conscience. And I guess all I have to say about American fascism is that it will, if we fail this moment, and I think there's a lot up for grabs now, it will come with the cross and the Bible. Who was it? Was it Sinclair Lewis? Who was the person that said that when American fascism comes to America, He'll be with a cross and a Bible. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's going to be a heavily religiously oriented fascism if it comes to that. And those people have been allowed to have power. Josh Hawley is straight up devout Christian. Everything he does, he will say, is motivated by Christ. It's a projection of his own will to power that he projects that into Jesus. But that's, you know, and I go back to there's a video that Bill Moyers made back in the 1980s in a series called God and Politics. I used to show it to my religion and politics class when I taught it. And in that video on Christian Reconstructionism, what we know now as Dominionism, featuring R.J. Rushdoony and Gary North and all the rest of those budding Christian fascists. One of the quotes I kept wanting my students to get was one of the preachers saying, "We are training up an army that will one day take over the country for Jesus." If you'll go back and you'll look at Hawley's address to maybe King's College, I think it was, where he invokes Pelagius. This one was in the news this week or whatever. It's Pelagius as the boogeyman of all future Western horrors. He says pretty much that, uses that empirical conquest language. So I think American fascism is going to not be a secularist phenomenon as much as it is a religious one. If it comes to that, I don't think it's going to come to that. I still think the 6th of January, as we learn more and we unpack that, we're going to find out how close we came. But I think that there is going to be a shift in a number of significant ways about what gets legitimated in this country.
Wow. And one last point or question.
I'd rather hear you talk it.
Would you? Well, let me just ask you one thing before I go. And I've been struggling with this too, and I'll respond to it after you respond to it. It's the role of violence. So many Christians and just citizens were just abhorred because violence is intrinsically wrong, right? But we all know that's not biblically the case, right? And we know that people like from Bonhoeffer to Nat Turner to Denmark Vesey, they use violence as a faith-based way of social transformation and social change, right? How do you make a critical distinction between the violence of Bonhoeffer and the type of violence that you see these evangelicals doing to kind of overthrow the Biden administration?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Personally, I'll roll with nonviolence, but nonviolence needs a community and a pretty significant, disciplined, strong community, which is what we committed ourselves to in Charlottesville on August 12th. People like Metaxas will use Bonhoeffer to justify a violent attack against this particular government. People will use Bonhoeffer without a deep reading and understanding of the collapse of the church in Germany against state power, the complicity of the church to align themselves with state power, and Bonhoeffer's own moral struggles with the fact that he said what he was doing was wrong. He did not justify participating in the conspiracy, in the camp of the conspiracy. But he said he could not allow what was going on to happen and not get his hands dirty. But he said by doing so, he knew he was in violation of the gospel. But he just said, in the end, I'm going to have to throw myself on the grace of Christ. Now, those people like Paul Hill, who assassinated an abortion doctor and invoked Bonhoeffer, I don't think they either did the reading, they didn't participate in the communities necessary for a nonviolent resistance to their particular understanding of what pro-life was. But for people that blithely use Bonhoeffer as a justification, they really haven't taken the time to do that sort of deep study into the cultural surroundings of Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer moved into the conspiracy because there was no community of the church to support practices that would have been more conducive to a better form of resistance to Hitler. The church itself, the community of the church failed, and when that failed, Bonhoeffer had no other option. In some senses, it was one of the most tragic lives in that respect that Christian history has seen. It was not a triumphant move. It was a move out of grief and sadness that the church, in its moment, 1933, 1934, the church failed. It failed to flood the streets of Germany with resistance to Hitler. It failed the appeals to hatred and anti-Semitism, to racism. It just failed.
Wow, thank you.
So, a couple of questions about violence. I want to wait till after Adam sets the stage from his perspective, but the one question was like very Bonhoeffer specific, and this was a discussion that started in the group, and then in something you said that stuck with me, Jeff. You said that let's see, where is it? The God of the Bible gains ground and power by being powerless. Should the church be Christian and stand by God, one has to stand by God's pain. And like asking where is the pain of God in the world in a particular moment was this was your response into how to help congregations and people of faith think through discipleship. And you said the question Bonhoeffer's asking wouldn't be like, how do you fit these grandiose narratives or metaphysical visions or ethical absolutes? The question would be, where is God in pain in a moment? And then you know where solidarity is demanded. And I just think that that's such a beautiful question to ask in this time. And I don't know, like there are two different questions that came in about that were connected to it. One was, how do you articulate the divine pain in a moment where the one you're articulating it is supportive of, essentially Pharaoh or Rome in this moment, right? Like, it's not like someone told the centurion after crucifying Jesus, bad idea. He came to himself in a sense and said, surely this is the Son of God. It's like, how do you articulate this hermeneutical perspective as a Christian when you're in a context that like that question couldn't arrive? In a sense, if you just watch some of the YouTube videos that people sent in, at one point I was going to play sermon snippets and then get your commentary, and then thought, no. But if you just played them and then said, oh, what would James Cone and Dietrich Bonhoeffer think? They'd be like, that's accurate. It's just they mean it the opposite way, right? Like the forces of light and forces of darkness, taking a stand on behalf of the crucified God. Like all these things, just mean it the opposite. So in what way, or is there a way to introduce this hermeneutical perspective where when you ask where God is, you begin by attending to the pain in the moment before attending to your privilege, to your power, to your possessions, and to your presumptions, often of patriotism, nationalism, and stuff.
I'm just going to go ahead and make a quick response. It's the telos that reveals the integrity of the moment. If you're claiming the cross of Christ for conquest or imperial power, or to maintain your social status as the powerful, then I'm just going to go ahead and say that you're claiming a false gospel. the telos reveals a lot about what it is that you're proclaiming. What is the end? What is the goal toward which you act, you move, you preach? And if the end is the maintenance of political or social power, that's the point where Bonhoeffer's word about the powerlessness of God becomes excruciatingly powerful in its own regard.
Yeah. All right. So, Adam Clark.
Yes.
When you think of getting to introduce a lot of people for the first time to the breadth of Black theology, wrestling deeply with James Cone, getting some amazing visits from Monica Coleman, Jesse Jackson, like I've had multiple people, and I know you've been tagged on social media posts as well, going, they know what they would have thought if they hadn't spent that time in that class in this moment, because their friends and family are showing it to them. But because they wrestled with those texts in a learning context, then it cultivated the ability to see this moment differently. So, like, when you think of those conversations and things, how would you contextualize the work and witness of James Cone for our present moment?
Yeah, well, let me step back before I step forward. One of the things when I was first trying to think about kind of the theological meaning of what the 2020 elections would answer or react or clarify, it was really the question of what type of nation are we trying to become, right? Are we trying to become a more inclusive, pluralistic, multicultural, multi-faith society? Are we becoming much more of a kind of reactionary, race-limiting society, right? But so I was really hoping for a repudiation of Trumpism, and I didn't get it, right? Even though Biden won, there wasn't a clear repudiation of Trumpism. It survives. So part of actually what I think we're going to need to negotiate is that we can't spend all our energy reacting or trying to diffuse Trumpism and not trying to push the Biden-Harris thing. I think faith communities have to represent kind of a third force in American kind of politics. And I think, well, we could talk about that more later. But when looking at, thinking about the class and thinking about what happened, especially on January 6th, I think when we talked about the category of whiteness, right? I think that as a theological category came to the fore. And I think Jeffrey mentioned some of that, but and whiteness as an epistemic, I mean, a way of knowing, right? Like it's just so strange when we look at just, first of all, if you just look at the kind of electoral results, the majority of white people and the majority of white Christians voted for Trump again for a second time, right? The majority of Americans voted for Biden, but the majority of whites voted for Trump. And that's been just a kind of clear historical pattern. And it's very puzzling. It's puzzling, not so much about the whiteness, but also the Christianness. The Christianness is a doubling down on the whiteness, right? And that's what makes it, when people talk about the relationship between whiteness, Christianity, and white supremacy, it's not two separate things. That Christian identity is constitutive of, right, this kind of white supremacist attitude. And that's what makes it so troubling, because if you listen to kind of most of the political analysis, almost the entire discussion up to the election was about who's going to get the working class white vote. It was seen kind of economically about who's going to appeal. I call it the Archie Bunker vote, right? Like who's going to appeal to that person in West Virginia. And whoever appeals to that person most effectively will win the national election, right? But here's the kind of trouble that I think Trumpism reveals, that the issue is not primarily economic. The issue is primarily cultural, or a certain orientation in the world. And I would say even cultural, maybe / theological. It's a certain orientation in the world that's hard to uproot. That Christianity becomes assimilated into that orientation, is not distinctive from and not even critical of. Therefore, Trumpism and Christianity are like a seamless whole. There's no dissidence. There should be a radical dissidence between Trumpism and Christianity, but yet people can hold up the Trump flag and the Christian flag and see them as one. The Trump flag and the Confederate flag and see them as one, right? All of these type of symbols that I think that theologians are probably best equipped to describe the meaning of the moment, because there's so much rich symbolic meaning that's coming out of this, right? That it's loaded with interpretive symbols, and that just a kind of economic or sociological analysis does not do the trick, because there's something deep at the root. There's a deep anxiety and fear. And this is where I think that we could be in a lot of trouble unless things change dramatically. And I think that, and this is where I'm talking about, where I talk about the category of whiteness, meaning that if it's the case that that type of working class white identity is in part a reaction or contingent upon a suppression of Black and brown identities, right? That the sense of well-being of these type of working class white men is rooted in the exclusion and repression of other people, right? Then the only thing you could do is reconstruct that identity, right? That's the only option you have. It's not a different person in office. It's not even a different, we're talking about radical formation. And I think what's happening at the root of this is that we're going to have to talk about a way that people are being formed as being human, right? That we have to talk about the relationship between whiteness and humanness. And talk about how we can form people in ways that are more interconnected, instead of just trying to do the kind of race about who's up and who's down and that kind of thing. But I think that might be at the root, because what's happening now, it's just curious to me that there's never been an election where, well, let me backtrack here. Since 1964, the Civil Rights Act, right? White people, the majority of whites have never voted for a Democratic candidate. Not Clinton, not Jimmy Carter, not Barack Obama, and not Biden, right? So ever since Blacks have been more included into the American system, the majority of whites have favored the opposite candidate. That's a heck of a statement. And that doesn't seem like to lead to a sustainable democracy. So in order to really talk about a sustainable and lasting democracy, I think we have to talk about this issue of racial and cultural formation in a new way and get at that. And I think the church can be either at the foreground or the background of trying to form that.
Yeah, I think that's real. I mean, that's really important. I know recently on the podcast when I was talking with Willie Jennings, he spends quite a bit of time, looking at the notion of formation and whiteness. And he kind of, he brings out three different features: possession, control, and mastery. And if you just spend a little bit of time looking at TikTok videos of the Trumpanistas with their Jesus flags, their shofars, and their combat boots, like it looks like an anxiety around a culture where possession, control, and mastery might require them to accommodate and validate space of people that don't have like white bodies, that come from patriarchal cultures, and and share the same deep religious commitments that are their eternal justifications for those power structures. Like like when you're saying that, I just think it resonates. I've been reading his book for, working on a review for the Scottish Journal of Theology, but like it just it's so sitting there, and like a number of the questions that came in were from ministers in different positions, but are like realizing how impotent whatever they thought they were doing when they were doing Christian formation was doing. And so I feel like that conversation that you're having there still connects to conversations we had with Jeff around the arcane disciplines and like how Bonhoeffer tried these like alternative seminaries and thinking about different ways of formation that and we can come back to it. I just want to like make sure the question of formation is such an important one.
I would say two things: formation, also understanding Trumpism as like a new religious movement, right? It's not just a political ideology. It's faith-based. This is why it's so hard. This is why it's post-truth in that sense, that facts or even evidence on the ground does not change the opinion, right? It doesn't change the actual thinking process. And that's what makes it so, it's a phenomenon, right? It's not just a type of, it's almost like you could call it like a cult movement, right? It's a cult of personality, but it's also the cult of Trump, which is distinct from the Republican Party, right? You have Republicans and then you have people who are Trumpists, and the Trumpists have taken over that, which is a real danger. It takes it in a new direction. But for us to have the kind of theological tools to kind of understand this as a new religious movement that is really based on these type of, it's because the whole thing, and what I was going to try to talk about about the idea of violence is that Christians have an idea of just war theory, right? Like in terms of that. But the first evidence of just war, you have to have a just cause. Even the cause itself was based on a false premise and that type of thing. But there are times within Christian, I come out the liberationist tradition. So there are times when you talk about there may be, even though I'm personally like for nonviolence, but there are times when, that you could talk about lethal force is morally acceptable within the just war theory. But it has to fit all different types of criteria: last resort, proportionality, just authority, all of these different types of criteria it has to match. It's not just because you're angry because you lost an election to your opponent, right? there's no framing of that makes that possible. But even the first criteria is always a just cause. And a just cause is not because you lost the election, but the idea that you really believe that based on this false premise, right? And this gets on to kind of how whiteness is constructed, right? In this way that there's a certain feedback loop that doesn't take in this new information, right? It just has this type of closed ideology in terms of that. And I'm talking about, and I should say that's probably more Trumpism than whiteness in and of itself, but it's a very, very hard thing. And I don't know if you can't just defeat it at the electoral box, right? You have to find a way to diffuse it, right? And I think that should be the challenge, is how do you diffuse Trumpism? Because you can't stamp it out. These people aren't going to go away. And they're also going to be members of our society. So if you're trying to think big and trying to move forward, how do you move forward? People who honestly feel this way, right? They believe there's a false consciousness. They believe these type of things, but yet you have to push society forward in spite of these kind of fringe theories. How do you do that? What does leadership look like that's able to speak to that and do that and draw people to a higher purpose?
Yeah, and that's, that's a problem. I don't see that leadership in the political world. I see William Barber exerting that leadership.
Yeah, right.
But he scares the shit out of people.
Yeah.
If I was thinking about what you just said, Adam, and we don't understand the sort of communal assumptions that have formed our identities. And particularly those people that sort of have embraced Trumpism. If you ask them, they would say, well, some of my best friends are Black.
That's right.
But the very fact that any kind of threat to white power in civil society becomes an existential threat to their very identities. reveals how deeply their identities have been woven by white supremacy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And they just
Absolutely.
don't know it. They don't understand it. And this is where the failure of the church for me is as deep as in Germany. They failed to come to grips and look in the mirror of their own anti-Semitism. And the church fails to come to grips and look into the mirror of its own racism. And one of the great ironies is that if America does collapse or does fragment, Christianity and racism will be the two great causes of it.
Yeah, yeah. And that's also kind of encapsulated as kind of apocalyptic worldview, right? That a lot of the Trumpers are inhabiting. They're inhabiting an apocalyptic worldview where it's like the end of the age, so that all things are justified, right? Any type of behavior is justified.
Yeah.
And they know it's the end of the age when you go to Georgia, right? And you get a Black and a 33-year-old Jew who get elected to the Senate. That feels like the end of the age, the end of America, right?
Yeah, to me like we got 2 years of breathing space.
Right. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, just two.
So one of the topics that came in from two different people was initiated by Adams posting multiple pictures with our to-be senator Warnock, and also the declaration he has to purchase your ice cream next time you hang out.
And you've got to buy Warnock's book.
Yeah, well, yeah. I'm just thinking I'm like 1 degree of separation from the senator now, and Adam's going to help me get him on the podcast because it'd be fun. But the one of the questions that came in, and you could both respond. Maybe Adam go first. One, to share about his relationship with James Cone, obviously as his dissertation advisor, but for people who were in the class, or a couple that said, I couldn't figure out what the basic talking points were for explaining to my family and friends at Mitwell, just like the basic adjustments to understanding why Warnock is just kind of, the not crazy evangelical expression of the Black church. It's like they just notice these issues, right? And there are these different ways. Like, I can't figure out how to explain it. I'm just like, read Crossing on a Lynching Tree, and thinking of the way he was ran against, right? Yeah. And I didn't see these ads because I'm in Scotland, but I had them sent to me, and I was like, well, how bad is it? And then I got sent these links. I'm like, Jesus. In one part, I'm hoping that Biden and Warnock tag team and do all the crazy things that they were suggested they were supposed to do. But on the other side, how do we, as leaders in faith communities and those invested, both articulate this expression of the church, and how should we understand that tactic of kind of like selectively editing from a confessional place, isolating it, and then propagating it to this type of racist trait?
We called it Jeremiah writing Warnock, right? Like they tried to do the same thing that they did to Obama with Jeremiah Wright to Warnock. It just didn't work as well. But basically, a lot of it comes from ignorance on the history of the Black church. And this kind of gets back to also violence and some of the also kind of rhetoric in terms of people lifting, like, let's say, the Jericho March, right? A lot of it's a lack of like understanding sociology. Like, I think it's, in order to really understand the Bible, you have to understand that these were peasant people, right? These were middle class, professional class people. These type of like kind of, they're appropriating certain types of language of people who are a deeply marginalized group in their society. We're talking about biblical people, colonized groups. It's almost like, probably a better analogy would be if Native Americans appropriated that kind of rhetoric, not like white middle class people. But in terms of Warnock, first of all, let me just say, number one, he has his own book. It's called The Divided Mind of the Black Church, right? I would encourage people to check that out if you want to get his kind of authentic. And it's based on his dissertation, where he really does like kind of talks about the history of the Black church and its upbringing, and He talks about women's theology, and he really talks about the different trends and traditions and trajectories of the Black church. So if you want to understand that, he could talk about multiple streams. And he also talks about the Black evangelical church, as well as the liberationist Black church as well. So I would encourage people to look at that as more of an authentic expression of his writings rather than these type of bits and pieces. But that type of propaganda isn't meant for truth telling. That's the main thing here. It's meant to crazify, to disregard, to delegitimize, right? That's the intent. So if you have a strong reaction, it worked, right? That's what it's supposed to do. If you want to actually get the kind of a more accurate representation, you have to do a little research on your own, like maybe go to a library or go to an actual academic book and not go to a political campaign for a way of knowing who the opponent is, right? So part of it's, it's that you have to have a little bit of agency. And now that we're in a Google world, it's right at your fingertips. It's on your phone. You could do it yourself. It's not that difficult, but never get your primary sense of the world from a campaign ad, right? You have to go beyond that. So I would just say that in terms of, but even with that, when we looked at the Jeremiah Wright, because many of us who are in the Black theological tradition had to come out and really talk about, first of all, the history of the Black church and being at the underside of America, meaning that if you look at the history of the Black community, Black people have been enslaved in this country longer than they've been free. This country has only been a full democracy since 1964, right? That's when the Civil Rights Act, where there's the inclusion. So that's only a little over 50 years, like 55 years, right? So we've been in this country, right, for over 400 years. So the majority of the time, so when I'm talking about the Black community, we've been enslaved longer than we've been free. So the language that comes out of the church, right, is shaped by that historical conditioning, right? So even the tropes, the metaphors, certain types of enthusiasm that comes out of the Black church is shaped by that. So that type of conditioning, Black people understand these type of tropes because that's what they're socialized with. Where, someone else who may be an outsider might see it as shouting or loud if you're used to kind of, So part of it's understanding the worship format and also understanding how you identify within the Bible. I think Jeremiah Wright was talking about Psalms, where you talk about the killing of babies and then the weeping and the gnashing of teeth and all these type of things. Well, that resonates, that type of concrete suffering, it resonates with Black life in a deep and meaningful way. So he talked about the damnation of America, right? He talked about it in terms of looking at how in the Hebrew Bible, when God's promises are not fulfilled, then there's damnation. He didn't say it as a curse word. He said it as a theological statement about God's wrath will rain down for not fulfilling the covenantal promises. So it was deeply theological the way it was read within the Black church, but outside the Black church, it was seen as him just trying to be anti-American or anti-white or promoting hate speech, which was not the intent. And I think similar things are going to be, projected onto Warnock.
But you see, this is the problem with American civil religion, right? Mm-hmm. Because American civil religion, is constructed on white supremacy, so that anything that questions, calls into legitimacy, the American experiment, writ large, is in and of itself out of bounds.
That's right.
So, and in that, then it becomes a completely unbiblical, well, maybe it's a totally biblical thing, because there are always counter narratives happening with Israel going on all the time, right? We're this, and then the prophets come and go, no, you're not this. You suck.
That's
You
right.
suck. You
Right.
have trampled the poor, and the rich grow richer, and you suck. And you can just see the court evangelicals or the court priests going, no, we're great. God chose us. So the way that religion functions to construct a society or a culture and its legitimation, when that gets called into question, people get very, very nervous. They get very anxious, because then you're questioning the very basis on which their identities are constructed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so Jeremiah Wright I'm sorry, I cuss like a truck driver I used to be. They become terrified that the world that they have built around themselves is crumbling. And I just want to go ahead and say, it is a pastoral task to try to help guide people who are willing to go through that very, very difficult water. Because in some ways, what they also don't understand is that the God that they have constructed and projected and have labeled it Christian is tied to that sort of social construction of the state, American exceptionalism. So that to give up that notion of American exceptionalism is to give up God. And nobody wants to be an unbeliever who is sincerely, sincerely in their souls, cares.
Yeah, and to add to what you just said, just as the nation of Israel is a theological construct, America is a theological construct. And one of the pillars is the idea of innocence, that America is innocent. It never intentionally does anything wrong. May make mistakes, but they make mistakes with the best of intent, right?
When I was in third grade, my history teacher called them whoopsies.
Right. Whoopsies. Right.
And I repeated it to enough people at some point. My dad was like, "What did you say?" I was like, our whoopsies. And I explained, he's like, "Yes, that's not what we're going to use."
Right.
And
right. But the issue is evil does not reside in the soul of America. Right. It might be the soul of individual people.
Right.
But not in the soul of America. So it's always a surprising possibility when evil breaks out, because you have this theology of innocence, right? So you have this theology of promise and a theology of innocence that kind of structures the way Americans from the sunny side, right? But if you're born on the underside, you kind of see through that. So you're not surprised. So a lot of times you're conditioned by this dominant narrative. But if you're born on the underside of America, you don't see it because you don't receive that.
If only white Christians do a Jericho march around the U.S. Capitol and think only the president changes, if it works, right? Right. Like if you might be a white Christian if you do a Jericho march, and instead of like the walls come tumbling down, a dramatic shift of power and ownership of the land, like you have a giant redistribution of everything in the Jericho story. In white evangelicalism, they're like, we're going to use a shofar, non-ironically, and you know what we're going to do? Switch presidents by silencing the overwhelming majority of people that aren't white in the country, because democracy, freedom, and liberty, and the blood of the Lord, shofar, sound off now.
And yet,
right? Like that's like just that you use the Jericho line. There's just some. I got an argument with someone on Facebook, and I was like, "You got it." There's zero chance anyone other than a white American thinks a Jericho march just shifts who's in charge of the executive branch. They don't want to switch anything at the Supreme Court.
Right.
They're like, "No, we rigged that." Oh, the House and the Senate, we don't want to shift this.
Not to mention there was an angel, right, that comes beforehand, who talks to Joshua right before that. It is kind of a passive march. But then you have also the idea of conquest and genocide at the end of the story too.
I'm sorry. I just want to go ahead and jump in here and say that shofar stuff, with not just cultural appropriation, but those Christians are straight out anti-Semitic.
Yes.
And they would never say that. They would say, well, the Jews are our best friends. And you say, well, what happens if they don't accept Christ? Well, they're going to hell.
Yeah.
Wait,
Yeah.
I don't understand. Well, they, I mean,
Okay, so I've got so many questions that were sent in.
Yeah.
And I love shofar jokes because I feel like they're like the friendliest way to make certain people uncomfortable that should be uncomfortable more often, right? At the beginning of this movie called I think it's Jesus Camp, but it's this like parody of a Christian summer camp. Like this guy,
it's a real thing.
Yeah,
but
it
it's
used
a
to be.
documentary, man.
Yeah, I showed that in class, but they closed
no,
it
not
down.
Jesus Camp. It's not. It's the one. It's a actual fictional movie. So, but it's a making fun of Jesus camps. But this Jewish family sends their kid, and they're like, he's Jewish. We're going to try to save him. But there's like a shofar from these evangelicals at the beginning. And when I saw it at wherever I saw it, I'm like with friends that did not grow up in the South or in evangelical context in Los Angeles. They're like, why is that white Gentile playing a shofar at their kids? I'm like, oh, I got to introduce you to somebody. They were very secular Los Angelites, and they were like, really, Gentiles have shofars? And I'm like, have you met Jews for Jesus?
Red, white, and blue ones.
Yeah. Anyway, now I put a few super nerdy questions where I took things people sent in that both Cohn and Bonhoeffer talk about, and so they're vague enough questions that you can both go wherever you want. But this is like 9 different questions. They're all related to this one Tripp attempt to be a short question. It's a short Tripp question, not a short question.
Gotcha.
Short Tripp question. All right. So both Cohn and Bonhoeffer use the imagery of the cross to rethink and challenge dominant Christianity, especially Christianity of Christendom. The cross becomes a way to rethink 3 different things, probably more than 3, but they're in the questions that I'm summarizing here. 3, cross becomes a way to challenge traditional Christian understanding of power, to challenge Christian assumption of dominant culture, and to challenge Christians' commitment to their nation state. So how in this moment, and thinking of Bonhoeffer and Cohn, like what elements from their own thought would you want to bring up to how the cross helps us address the question of power, dominant culture, and the nation?
Do you want to go, Jeff?
Well, I'll take a shot. Let me just start first with the fact that in a certain sense, the cross relativizes all other allegiances. If your allegiance is primarily to the state, then it's not to the cross. And if your allegiance is to the cross, then it is to the one who was crucified by the state. So that in some senses, allegiance to the cross means inherent suspicion of state power in whatever guise it comes in, whether it's liberal or conservative. So that's one quick response. Another quick response is that the cross subverts the notions of power, because a power was unleashed in that event that still maintains itself in the world today. State power could not silence what takes place there. And that the very paradox of God in the ultimate moment of powerlessness unleashes something that ends up taking down the Roman Empire. Until they decided that they were going to go ahead and co-opt Christianity into the state and make it responsible for the state's fortunes. At which case the cross loses a great deal of its power to subvert the political order, and to subvert the political order in service of a better order of society and human flourishing and human relationship. Leave that there.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. I would agree with that. I would just add that the cross is the underside of empire, right?
Yes.
It really talks about solidarity with the poor, with the least of these, right? So what it signifies, and James Cone makes it explicit in almost every text he writes, is that death does not have the last word. That even though we might be in a situation of despair and anxiety, right? The cross represents that this is not the last word, right? There's something on the other side, right? So it's a symbol of hope, right? In that sense, the hope that anxiety, Trumpism, oppression, right, won't last always, right? That, and I like what Jeff talked about as relativizes, right? That these things that may seem overwhelming and so menacing and so ominous, right, are just temporary, right? That they're not eternal fixes. They're not going to be something that are everlasting, that there's something on the other side. And I think that what the cross does, and what I talked about earlier, is that I think the faith communities need to be a third force. It gives us that license to be a third force, to not go everything with the Democrats and just always reacting to the Republicans. But what's better than protest is alternatives. And the cross is a constructive alternative that leads the pathway to love and justice.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things that struck me about how the cross addresses kind of all three elements of power, nation, culture, and something that kind of connects Cone and Bonhoeffer is it so often the cross becomes a justification of a cross building God, and that for the dominant culture in the West, be it from the Roman Empire, like Jeff hinted at, to American Christianity, the cross has been turned into this symbol that gets carried along to undermining the nation on the 6th, right? But also just gets burned by the KKK. That the cross has become a symbol that is consistently contested, where one vision of the deity it represents is the one who puts people there if they don't submit to the sovereign. And the other vision is one where the sovereign is faithful in the face of injustice and violence, putting us on crosses, and says, through the power of the hope of the resurrection, my cross bearing is not an end of my power, right? And so, like, I feel like that cross bearing and cross building image of God is something that Bonhoeffer and Cone have in common. And you know, there are a number of questions of like, where do you begin to address these things in your congregation? And like, in one sense, and realize, like, I'm saying this as someone who hadn't been full-time in a church for 3 years after having been 15, so it's a little easier to say this now. But like, if your sermons on the cross are clear, then it shouldn't be hard to pick them up. You know, the cross is a symbol, just like God choosing against Pharaoh. God took sides, deep solidarity with those who bear the violence of empire. And it's just like, I'm not saying there's an easy solution and we aren't all complicit in some way in the United States with the imperial violence of the United States. We are. But I'm just saying, if you're going to lean towards Team Jesus, you got to at least say, maybe we're not on Team Cross building. We're on the cross bearing side. And it might actually cost us something to be faithful. And it just seems to me that one of the biggest underbellies of the white evangelical support of Trumpism, the elements of evangelicalism that have led to this type of Trumpism as religious movement, is one that can't differentiate its culture dominance from its discipleship. That dominating the whole and how well it does it correlates to whether it's been faithful, because it can't imagine itself as someone other than the one who decides who puts them on crosses. They'll literally figure out how to execute somebody right as they're walking out the door. Right. And that idea of faithfulness is just so disgusting, right? Like there's nothing in all four gospels that says like this sneaky way that Jesus is somehow identifying and valorizing this type of violence and this type of top-down power. And I just don't.
But Tripp, that means they're more identified with Herod than Jesus.
Right.
That they're more invested in the kingdom of Herod.
Right. If Herod can't be in charge, he will kill his kids, which he did. He will behead his wife, and he will kill a whole bunch of 2-year-olds. Right. Like that is the logic of Herod. And you just got to ask all these people Trump's thrown under the bus and ask like how much better is he? But he's been that the whole time. Homeboy is a birther from the beginning. I don't understand how, like everyone that told me that here, this is Tripp's question, not anyone else's. And I was wrestling with this the whole time in both of our classes. I've spent the bulk of my life saying to myself, Tripp, your sweeping judgment of white evangelicalism as inherently problematic and demonic is over the top. You got to talk yourself back. Some of your best people that you know are white evangelicals. You know, like I've spent most of my time going, you're being judgy. Yeah, there's tons. They donate more to charity than mainline Protestants. You know, like I just said all that stuff. And then I'm like in the Bonhoeffer class in lockdown. I'm like, I don't know. Then it's like we're hanging out with James Cone. I'm like, I don't know. And it's like, that's the thing I don't know what to do is, and there were a couple of questions that came in similar to this is, who are these events speaking for? Right? Because there's these different groups. I'm interested in how you see them. There's like, I literally showed up. Then there's apparently the 57% of Republicans that are like, yeah, this thing's stolen. I kind of identify somewhat with the people that wanted to storm the Capitol. Now, I just want you to know those numbers are less than all the Muslims everyone wanted their ministers to get up and repent for on their behalf publicly because their congregants thought they somewhat identified with Muslim radical terrorists. Right.
Absolutely.
Because of American imperialism, it's identification with apartheid Israel and all that kind of stuff. Right. Like 36% was the number that Sam Harris trotted around to justify throwing Islam under the bus. Was it 30% somewhat I understood Muslim terrorists? Well, we got way more than that in America of white evangelicals who somewhat understand this.
Or that sympathize with jihadists, remember
yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
I feel like if I went back 10 years, I would just tell myself, you ain't thinking dirty about them enough. Right? And I feel bad about that.
You're talking about a lack of self-critique. I mean, that's the whole look. I think one of the number one task of theology for the 21st century is to kind of change what Christians care about. We need to develop new forms of bonds of intimacy. And the liberationist tradition always talks about we need to define our identities from below, right? Like we need to actually be in intimate, serious solidarity and dialogue with below. And I think if that's the mission of what Christianity has to do, especially if those of us who are born in empire, right? It's going to take us, I think what you're pointing to is the idea that Christianity is too deeply invested in empire in an uncritical way, that even when it tries to do right, it imposes wrong, right? Even if there's an intent to do well, right? The uncriticalness still ends up being oppressive, and it's hard to disentangle from that.
Yeah, it is. I just want to go ahead and say that, the sort of the very human aspects of imperial collapse are somebody asked me a couple of years ago, said, well, should we burn it all down in a large group of people? And I said, well, I'm going on Social Security this month, so I'm not sure, how I feel about that, and, imperial collapse is going to cost. There may be a part of us that said, yay, the empire is collapsing and won't be able to do damage to the world. But I want to go ahead and say this. Part of the problem is that we have this sort of false narrative about, oh, this is fake Christianity. All these people out there, that's not real Christianity. No, that is real Christianity. Christianity, honestly, has been an imperial force, of a force of conquest and dominance since 313, or at least since 325. So you cannot separate out the expressions of Christianity now that we don't like and say that, oh, well, this is not Christianity. And those very narratives of conquest are in the Bible. So, you were just talking about the cross. Well, okay, we have the cross.
Joshua.
That's a narrative. But I'm telling you, there are a number of deeply devout Christians that look at that narrative of Revelation, where Jesus comes back and kicks ass, as the more dominant narrative than the cross.
Absolutely.
And that's the narrative that they've attached themselves to.
So it's a question of what's authoritative, right? What's authoritative?
So the canon within the canon, they don't read carefully to, if you're reading, say, Revelation, I think it's 18 carefully, the judgment that Christ brings upon the economic structures of the world, where the merchants of the world are standing in ashes, crying for the loss of their income, for the loss of their money, for the loss of their economic power. They don't look at how subversive those texts are to the kind of empire that Christianity was living within in the first, second centuries. And so they translate then that, and they also translate Hebrew scripture, Jewish scripture narratives into the present day as well. Trump is Cyrus, Trump is King Cyrus, the Jericho March. All of these things are narratives of conquest. They are not narratives of the God who loves humanity enough that God will enter into humanity and suffer to show the depths of that love. Look at me breaking all bad on my evangelical pass there.
Okay, so Brent just mentioned a question 2 other people sent in, and one of them was like, I want Adam to answer it because Jeff told the story in the Bonhoeffer class, and it was, and maybe you can set it up for people that weren't in both of them, Jeff, but it's the, like, we're at the point where we pray for the destruction of our own country, question. And you told the story about the Bonhoeffer Society, AAR, and I think it was Bruce McCormick, or I can't remember the exact story. Do you remember the story I'm thinking of?
No, it wasn't Bruce McCormick. It was George Hunsinger.
Okay. Well, people I associate with Barty and Princeton.
Yeah, I know.
Conglomerate. But so tell a story, think of how, and answer the question now, and then let Adam answer it. And I hear a teenager stomping above me, so I'm going to disappear and be right back in a minute after I remind him it's a school night, because everyone else other than the 13-year-old is asleep. And but yeah, tell a story.
If this is the story that I think you're thinking of, and I can't remember the year, but at American Academy of Religion meetings, we had a session that featured Jean Beck Elstein, Stanley Hauerwas, and George Hunsinger as the speakers, and I was the chair of the session. And at that point, things were a little tense between Jean and Stan. But at the end, George Hunsinger had the last word, and he said, and I think this was right after the Iraq War was started, right after the bombings and stuff of the Iraq War. And Hunzinger says, like Bonhoeffer, I pray for the defeat of my nation. And there was an audible gasp of horror in the room. I thought,
Wow.
it spoke well of George Hunzinger, that he would say that maybe it is in fact the case that this empire needs to die, so that the damage that it does in the world will be mitigated.
That's interesting. I tend to think about it. I think of the parable of the rich young ruler, right? What must I do to receive eternal life? Comes to Jesus, and sell all, right? Like it's like, I think of Nicodemus, right? You have to be rebirthed, and I can't go into my mother's womb, but I do think it's that level of metanoia, right? In terms of that, like I don't think that a political transformation alone is going to get at the problem we're trying to actually address, right? There has to be a metanoia, a complete turning of the spirit, a turning of the heart, an internal turning and a sociological turning as well, that needs to really happen in order to get at the kind of world we desire. And that's why I'm saying where faith communities have a really important role, but if you don't call us to they're not called to the highest possibility, right? They just conform and get flat and act like every other type of institution in society. So that's what's so disappointing. And I think that's why the Homebrew podcast and other people are so disappointed in where the church is today, because all it does is acts as a partisan. It doesn't see its role as trying to enact a metanoia at the heart of empire, right? So, I tend to turn to those stories and say, and think of it that way, the deep form of transformation that we all need to participate in.
One of the people that asked the question said, they've been wrestling with it since then, and then was in the Black theology group, which kind of gave a different perspective to ask the question. And she said that in her prayers, she's become more committed to all the people that make up America and less committed to its current structures and institutions. And I thought that was a good way of putting the challenge, right? Because sometimes certain types of revolutionary burn it down type movements preserve an antagonism when revisioning the perspective of a kind of post-current institutional structural system than the type of vision we think it's Christians. And something I've spent a lot of time thinking about recently is how the church should start thinking about organizing and planning itself for a kind of post-ecological collapse. But we don't have to talk about that right now. But I do think it'd be smart to think about it. So another question, nuggets of questions, were about the effects of lockdown, social media, and Facebook. And one way of putting the question is that as we went into lockdown, people were cut off from most of the spaces where they interacted with people that wasn't mediated by an algorithm that sought to energize their anxiety, fears, and judgments. And that meant they weren't at their church, where there were people that probably didn't vote with them all the way down every ticket. There were people at their church didn't agree with them on everything. And yet they all prayed the prayer of confession together, had the Eucharist together, right? They weren't at their job, where you're all working together for something that isn't some like giant battle that you have very little agency in as an individual. And there's so many ways, right? That the algorithmic mediated tribal elements of social media impact someone. And one of the there are a number of people ask questions about it, but one said, what do I do as a red state minister who spent my career invested in a community, and I feel like I've made lots of progress until someone retires and then Facebook gets them? And you can just think of how many people of my friends who say their parents retire, and then what happened? They lost their parents to Fox News, Facebook, and whatever. And then he said, we went into lockdown, and all of a sudden I lost every slightly right of center person in my rural church in a red state, who before was showed up at Black Lives Matter protests, had advocated for transgender recognition at the public school, like tons of things. He's like, all of a sudden they go into lockdown, spend 6 months staring at Facebook and algorithms, and now they don't think Joe Biden was elected. They're like all this kind of stuff. And he's like, I don't know what to do with that. It's like lockdown erased the community and everything there, where you saw people growing and it's like, I don't know what to do with it. At this point, my wife and I are just discussing moving to a blue state where at least I know I won't lose my job for being honest, and my kids won't grow up next to a bunch of QAnon. Again, I think that's a real question. There were enough people that mentioned things like that how do y'all see lockdown, both the economic changes and then the way digital mediation of our relationships has intensified, impact, sped up, or whatever this moment? Because and then like, what do you do as people of faith in that situation? I just, the second time I got an email like that, it was late at night, and I just teared up because I felt so bad. Knowing someone had dedicated their whole life to the gospel, right? Had been working so hard. And one of the churches the guy mentioned I've spoke at, they had me come. So, it's not like they just read an N.T. Wright book once. And
well, you're pointing to the problem of information ecology.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the challenge. That's not necessarily just a problem of faith communities. That's actually literally a global problem. It's interesting. I hear people say that, but since, my family, like, that doesn't really happen in the Black community, right? I don't see Black people being lost to Fox News. I don't see Black people actually denying the election. Like, that to me is actually a subset of the problem of whiteness, right? Like, even if you're well-intended, that there's a certain type of conditioning that appeals to certain types of anxiety. It may make sense, right? Somehow it makes sense, because to me, that doesn't even make sense. Like, I don't even kind of understand it. I struggle to have compassion and to really inhabit that type of space, because it's so distant from my personal experience, right? Like, if anything, there's the opposite direction, meaning that people go maybe farther to the left, not farther to the right in terms of that. But I think that's, what I tell my students about that is that I try to encourage them, follow 3 people that you disagree with, right? It's always good to have people who are sharp critics of your position, because they make you rethink your position. So to me, this is about the failure of the American educational system, right? I think the rise of Trumpism is that, because all of us have devoted our lives to the academy in one way or another, and it's so disappointing to see what passes as truth in authoritative knowledge, right? It's almost like, when we came up through the movement of postmodernism and people said, well, facts don't matter. It's all about interpretation. No, facts matter. Facts matter. Science matters when we're talking about the pandemic, right? Like, your opinion is not the same as a scientist who went through certain types of trials and have evidence-based knowledge. Like, it's not identical to each other. So just the status of what's authoritative knowledge, right? We have to kind of highlight and mark.
Do you remember at beer camp, and like, this was the one you spoke at in Los Angeles, Adam, where like when Trump got inaugurated, right? Like, and we had
that's right. Yeah.
And it was a depressing moment, considering I timed beer camp so that there would be like a moment for the inauguration of the first female president. But nonetheless, one of the things you just said, because you did this talk on post-truth, and you were like, I just don't trust post-truth white Christians. And I was like, I think he's overstating it. That might be too much.
They've been post-truth for a long time. White Christians have been post-truth for a long time.
I know.
But
I just thought that, you know, that was
this is a different category, though. This is a different category of post-truthness that's really, like, I think it's a more diabolical here, because you could actually, because it's impervious to evidence, right? Like I don't think that people can imagine like how ridiculous that the election was stolen, right? As a feature of trying to overthrow the government, of actually bullying a Secretary of State, find me 11,000 votes, right? Like that is so dramatic. I think what happens is that we hear this and we get so numb to it that we normalize it. But I think once we could get out the stupor, like we won't, that the stuff that happened in that administration will be so unbelievable and so shocking. But I think now, in order to protect ourselves emotionally and even intellectually, we numb ourselves down and try to make it, well, that's just Trump being Trump and that kind of thing. No, that is outrageously shocking, right? Like this, he should have been removed from office a long time ago for lesser than this. It should never got to this point.
Interestingly enough, I mean, we are not unique in this regard. Nazi Germany was constructed the same way, so that the Nazi conscience was a conscience that was constructed by certain practices, certain rituals, certain sort of public behavior, so that to the point, for instance, where people would talk on a good day, it would be Hitler weather. Right? Do you get it? And their conscience gets constructed in such a way that, and it's very subtle what happens. And I think we've seen it happen in America right now. When the state comes to take away Hans, you don't say, what an injustice that Hans is taken away. You end up saying, how sad that Hans, my friend, was a Jew. You understand the distinction? So that, that what we have in, oh, well, what about Black Lives Matter? Oh, well, Black Lives Matter because you keep killing them. You think that you have the absolute omnipotent power to kill Black bodies without any consequences or any punishment. So that when people then resist that, then you say, oh, how terrible that people are resisting this. So the very conscience gets constructed in such a way that it empties a person's humanity. And that, so then that person becomes not a human being who is being oppressed, but a symbol of something that you've been taught to fear.
Right.
So in that way that disinformation works, we've become more susceptible to weaponize fear because of technology than we ever have been before.
And it becomes like this in-group and out-group, right? So part of the idea, this is why QAnon and all those things are so hard to combat, even though they are factually untrue, right? To the in-group that receives this, they have the status of revelation, right? You don't know because you're not part of the in-group, right? So it's almost like the only thing that could drain the kind of swamp is people who are insiders who actually can do something. Like the outsiders are almost immediately discredited as being outsiders and not receiving part of the revelatory knowledge, right? And that it has to be deconstructed from the inside out, not the outside in. And that's a feature of a kind of binary religious worldview, right? That's a part of Abrahamic faith traditions, right? That Jeff was saying, before, that become inherently problematic, and they take kind of the scaffolding, the templates from these traditions and apply it to this kind of quasi-religious phenomenon of Trumpism.
You mentioned in the class, Adam, about kind of this precognitive or preconscious type of racism. And I think that's important to recognize, because one of the things that shows up in some of the questions that I was trying to collect there about ministers asking, right, is what they're running up against isn't any like physical thing anyone did in their congregation to any actual person they've interacted with. It's the way in which their agency, authority, power, right, as individuals, and the way they experience the world is shaped by these kind of precognitive, deep commitments to whiteness. And so whatever the reality is has already been filtered and sifted to connect to it. And I mean, you mentioned the in-group, out-group thing. I've been spending time on this for a project that who knows if I'll get to go do it in person for psychology and theology on this project I've been working on group psychology and ecclesiology. But if you know, the social psych evidence on, like, if you're wanting to address this for people that are in a conspiracy theory or in an ideology, the most destructive thing you can do is for them to have a really good friend who's also friends with someone in that group. Right. So the United States government has spent a bunch of money planting non-militant Muslims that join Al-Qaeda and then say, I don't know if we got to kill them. I mean, I'm friends with someone, and you just say you're friends with someone wherever the plan is. And like, but that's out of the data on, not like you have to be friends with, right? Because then the defense mechanism comes up with you're friends with someone who's friends with. And the other is like, what valorizing images do you depict? Is it a valorizing image who sacrifices out of your ideology for your in-group, or out of your ideology for your out-group? Now, you want to know what the difference is between January 6th and all the protests I went to? When I was young, I got interrupted by an elderly African-American woman who explained to 19-year-old Tripp, ready to get crazy at a protest, this is a nonviolent protest, and that type of action is not welcome here. Right. And then she grabbed my shoulders and said, I would like to talk to you. How are you feeling? And she walked me in the back while we're talking. And then you find out, if you're in an activist group, what happens on the
leadership.
left? Leadership, nonviolent organizations, and you learn how to do these things. You want to know what did not happen with Yankee Doodle Dandy and company? Nobody with a Dixie flag has been to a nonviolent protest training ceremony. Like, that's just not happened, right? Like, and so I feel like there's like these different operating systems going on in it.
But you believe your opponent is evil. That's the whole of outside group of us versus them. That the
so like, what are you valorizing? Right. Part of the valorization, I think, that you saw at the heart of King's work, and even in one of the things James Cone emphasizes, like Christ is black on behalf of everybody. If Christ isn't black, God can't be on for everybody, right? Like, it's only by it identifying with the underside that you can have a just vision for the whole.
Absolutely.
And anyway, sorry, that was I haven't preached in lockdown enough, so it just starts sliding out.
But the philosophical question that you're pointing to is, how do you think difference, right? How do you think different? And we don't have an adequate cultural language to think different in a productive way, right? Trumpism otherizes all forms of difference, right? And when the difference becomes, it's not just how you relate to difference, it's internal difference, right? That you're even harder on the in-group members who don't relate to difference in a hostile way, i.e. Mike Pence, right? We're going to hang Mike Pence. He didn't do what he was told, right? That you're even harder on your own members than you are even on the outsiders, right? That they become more shocking, and the wrath comes directed at them. So I think part of what a new Christianity, to use kind of Brian McLaren's language, is going to have to do is to think about, how can Christianity relate to difference? Like, it's a religion that's based on neighborly love, right? Maybe the question we have to say is, who is our neighbor? And we have to have a more of an expansive idea. The neighbor isn't just the sameness who just lives next to me. We have to think about neighbor in more expansive and global categories. Even the non-human neighbor, right? We have to talk about they becoming our moral scope in that way, and talk about how we relate to that. And has to be at the heart of the faith, right? Mm-hmm. That may be the task of what we need to do in congregations.
Yeah.
So Tripp, I don't know what other questions you have, but I have one.
Well, can I ask you one follow-up real quick, and then you ask that? Like,
sorry.
So no. I will forget it. That's the main reason. The one of the questioners connected to that asked about something we spent time talking about, Bonhoeffer's critique of technology, right? And so Bonhoeffer's observations in Ethics, Letters, and Papers around the way in which modern technology is mediating our relationship with each other, mediating our relationship with nature, and then the culture shaped by this industrialization, this commodification system, then gets internalized in the church, that its value system gets reorganized, right? And so part of Bonhoeffer's problems with his critique of modernity and his critique of the church are connected to his ultimate critique of Nazism. And I wonder if we're thinking about, the questions of what we do with our physical communities, when all of a sudden, even those physical connections get cut out, if we are like, how, with a Bonhoeffer suspicion of technology, should we take what we're learning in this time to think of what is it like to have community when the expression of a algorithmically mediated community where the physical interaction's been removed is so ugly, right? Like, does that make sense? Like, I feel like his critique of technology raises some really important questions for ministers thinking of a post-COVID nature of community and church.
Yeah, and if I had that question, I could have maybe given a more eloquent answer. I am going to say this. Well, in that section, what Bonhoeffer's talking about is not only sort of the erasure of nature as a formation of identity, but he's also talking about the way that mastery, that technology ends up being mastery of control. So that, for instance, Hitler's able to use the technology of amplification to control the masses. Media is able to use the technology of media to control the masses. So that there is a relationship then between technology and control, such that maybe we need to take a serious look at the way that technological power accrues into ever increasingly fewer and fewer hands. Mm-hmm. And with that technological power also comes economic power. And so the more that power concentrates or centralizes into one person, the more distorted the world becomes, the more distorted our relationships among one another become. And the more power and control we give over people who will be able then to kind of construct identities going forward. And at that point, then it's not just a situation of the church. I think that there's going to have to be some, and I hate to say this because of my Anabaptist streak, but there's going to have to be some understanding of the way that governmental power can break up the ability of technological power to construct our identity so unalterably that 74 million people, well, I don't know that 74 million people are QAnon, but that millions of people will accept what probably will turn out to be a Russian op into destabilizing Western civilization.
But it is wild. Like, one of the research seminars at University of Edinburgh this week was on someone who does, I mean, she has a book coming out with the University of Chicago on conspirituality, and her article is in Religious Dispatches this week, and did this research on the way in which kind of New Age spirituality connects with conspiracy thinking, and then like the way the religious right connects with this, and definitely charismatic traditions. And what's so fascinating about it is, as someone who, compared to the rest of the Europeans in the seminar, like knew hundreds of people who like took new news of foreign policy and put it with a chart about the end of the world, or lost sleep when they read Frank Peretti books, or like took Left Behind books seriously. Like I'm just sitting there like the whole time going like, you're surprised people like I don't get it, because the thing about this is one of those like crazy stories. If it's not your story, that then everyone acted on, right? Like, what are the ones they didn't act on? Like, we should eliminate dirty water across the globe. I remember Billy Graham giving that speech at a Graham Crusade, saying like, we're gonna everything we're giving tonight is like to give people healthy drinking water around the globe. No one was just like, that's all we're doing. We're gonna storm the Capitol until America's like, we're ending people without healthy drinking water. But like that's the thing that I didn't. It wasn't that people believe any of it. Like, I'm sure I believe crazy things that someone else would be like, Tripp, I can't believe. But it's like, of all your beliefs, which are the ones you're going to go do something that drastic, right? Or then which are the ones you're going to provide cover for? And a couple of my friends that we were in the seminar discussing, and then one of them had a friend who's doing this algorithmic research thing. And so, like, if you just take QAnon and you ask people directly about QAnon, no. The percentage is low. But if you just check people on Facebook who Facebook identifies as evangelical and white, which they're pretty good at identifying that kind of thing because it's in their market desire to, which ones have shared memes or YouTube videos by people, if you just look at everything else they're doing, are like Q compliant. It's huge.
Yeah.
Right. And so, like, part of the issue is there's like, I don't remember who said earlier, but I think Adam did, about the ecosystem of what it is we're being put at. And that's the challenging part, right? One of the questions that came in is like, what do you do?
Feedback loops.
Right. It's a feedback loop. So it makes it worse. Like, if they really believe it, if it was true, then what would you do? And I'm like, but it's not. Yeah. But if you're talking to someone and they believe it's really, really true. Like, I talked to someone, friend of mine, PhD, and he was so far left, he went around to being a QAnon conspiracy theorist, and from like the eco side of things. And he messaged me and he's like, Tripp, if you know that everything that happened at the Capitol was just actors, and if you don't understand that, I can't help you. And I was like, huh? And before lockdown, that would have not come out of his mouth. After lockdown, it did. And it was just like, I don't know what to do. And so I feel like there's a sense of like the way your framework so screws up your head that the ministers that ask the question are like, if we had that radical fidelity about like anything cool, it would be awesome.
But Tripp, you should go to your favorite author. You should say, look, Uncle Screwtape, don't mess with me. I don't want Wordsworth. I don't want none of these. I don't want any Junior Devils, because you're messing with my head. Right?
Jeff wrote the updated version of it, Devil's Inc.
I actually like that book. I'm sorry that it just bombed. But I do want to say, to my earlier point, so maybe we ought to look into that deep and dirty shit that Sheryl Sandberg is leaning into. And maybe we ought to ask questions about power. Who has the power at Facebook to construct the algorithms? Who has the ability to manipulate data? Can I ask a question?
No, I want you to ask the question you were about to ask before I.
Yeah, I'm getting ready to ask a question. I'm getting ready to ask that question. What? Just You two guys, what was your visceral reaction when you were watching the video of Wednesday? Did you have a visceral reaction?
Yeah. Do you want to go first, Tripp? Or
So it led to me staying up late. I saw it, and then my immediate reaction was to turn the live stream YouTube of alternative media on that I thought would show things that the other ones weren't showing on. And then I went and checked close friends and family members' Facebook feeds to make sure they weren't saying stupid things. Because I just once it happened and realized what's going on, I'm like, oh no. And then once it got to the point of like, you know, where it had transcended on the news media, which clearly it did earlier, but transcended like drunk frat boy status of something you get away with just white privilege and a smile. I'm like, oh, this isn't good, because some shits are going to be armed. And then it was even worse. Like, they knew where they were going. They had been in previously. They got ready to tie people up, all that kind of stuff, right? We didn't know that then. And I'm just sitting there going, oh my, oh. And the thing that, the thing that hit home for me that isn't coming out, just it isn't the emphasized one that stuck, is there is a very large minority of the country who actually does not care about being in a democracy. And we've known this if you're like a real progressive, you know, but like you thought, oh, we'll just do passively violent things, right? We'll just have a police that just happen to be racist. We'll have an electoral college, or we'll have a Senate, or like we'll have all these things. We'll like come up with Jim Crow voting laws, and then we'll figure out how to get them back in. Now the Supreme Court says it's been a while since they weren't racist, you know, and they'll do all these things short of like just killing the vice president. But then that happens. And I don't think everyone there like had that deep intention. It's just like, I have been with groups of people where there was like one or two people that took things too far. And they only took it too far because everyone else in the group was almost there. And if you just start beginning, like, that's like you get caught. And you're like, now, yes, we were inebriated. We broke in. And when they decided to defecate and write their name on the wall, I was against it. And also, I'm an honor student. Thank you. I was in the military. You're welcome. Thank you for my service. Like, that was a thing that like freaked me out, because I was like, oh my God. And then watching the responses, right? I feel like the left and the Democrats have had to exaggerate what they thought happened all these ways, just because there's a whole group of people that won't even acknowledge reality. And then the way they're responding then feels like a threat that to people that weren't involved, that makes them even more anxious. And I feel like this whole thing was set up to make us dumber, meaner, more angry, because we won't admit the reality of what's going on. And I'm just worried. Like, that was my main thing. And I'm in another country. I haven't seen anyone that's known me for more than 2 years, other than my family, for 18 months, except on video. And I was just like sad, you know, like that it happened wasn't surprising. I was more anticipating like the lone wolf type of violence, but like given today's votes, that only 10 Republicans voted that way and then spent hours lecturing us. Like, there were 7 of them that specifically mentioned acts of violence that we know white dudes that are racist got arrested for in their talks. They're like, wow, this building was burned down. And we're like, yeah, Boogaloid boy did a dumb shit. Like, so they are intentionally not recognizing what's going on. And it's just, that's so ugly. I don't know what to do about it. I don't know how to relate to a large number of people that loved me in every interaction I've had with them, who think that's reasonable. I mostly wish I knew how to exorcise demons. So that was my response, is it made more and more clear. And then I start checking Facebook. Which ones of my family and friends are saying this? And then I want to be clear. I don't know. I think it's a good expression of how my feelings were. I don't know if I haven't processed it yet. Y'all are supposed to help me with that.
Well, for me, gosh, it's hard to really access because there's so many shocking events, right? Like it's hard for me, I didn't even pay attention. Like, it was such a long thing that I don't think I understood the gravity of it immediately. I probably understood it after maybe a day or two because I wasn't like, I think I was doing something else. So I was paying attention to the TV, but wasn't really engrossed. I might have had it on mute. But the most visceral thing was, man, I've been part of so many marches. I would have been dead. Literally, I could have never have done that. And to me, that was the shocking thing that they were living. The shocking thing is how far they got, right? To me, that was the function of white privilege. The fact that they even got to the Capitol. I mean, they had been saying, if Trump doesn't win, I'm going to start a civil war. They had said that since day one of his presidency. This was totally anticipated. So, I'm thinking, in terms of all these organizations in the Black Power movement, right? Like that actually talked about, I mean, they were wiretapped, there was disinformation campaign, there was COINTELPRO, there's all these things trying to disrupt. And I'm like, how did they get this far, right? And that to me was the immediate, that even with Black Lives Matter, it's a peaceful protest. I mean, you have people being maced and run over and all these. And I was just so surprised at the effectiveness of white rage, right? That white rage, unchecked, how it was able to consume the Capitol and how it was able to be basically many times escorted throughout it, and how light the resistance and pushback was. And that was the immediate kind of stunning to me information to me. But to me, I'm still shocked that people don't see Trump as an enabler of even COVID, right? Like you can't, that COVID would be hard to stop, but it didn't have to be something that lasted until today, right? That he undid all the offices, he teased wearing masks, he had so many mask spreaders events, he gave it to his wife, he gave it to his son, right? Like that. I'm surprised at the fact that he was impeached like less than a year ago, and no time in the campaign was it framed as Biden's running against an impeached president, right? It's almost like he's a Teflon Don. He does the most horrible things, and it doesn't seem to stick. There's no stigma to it. He just calls it fake media. You don't know, it's a witch hunt, and he's able to kind of move without like mass impunity and get 74 million people to vote for him. That to me is still stunning. So it's hard for me to actually, I don't know, it almost feels like a dystopian novel, right? Like in terms of, sometimes I go to get Big Brother, sometimes I go to Brave New World, sometimes I go to Octavia Butler, right? Sometimes I go to Screwtape Letters, right? Right? Like it just feels so dystopian what's happening right now, that our normal sense of what normal has been so overturned and prodded and poked with, and there's not a sufficient sense of outrage and resistance against it. And that's what's like just shocking to me. So I look at this through, I think this could be, dystopic in terms of that. People go to the biblical dystopias like the apocalypse and that kind of thing. But I think there's other forms of literature that kind of get right to. I'm like, is this Big Brother? Is this some type of like, groupthink, right? And this kind of, people are having thought crimes of saying that within the Republican Party that the election is fair and free, right? Like, or is it a sense that we're amusing ourselves to death where we're not even paying attention to what's happening because we're so into our cultural, either gaming systems or sports or whatever the type of pleasure we are, that we don't even see what's happening around us? It's hard to see what like is matching this moment, and maybe it's a combination of multiple things, but it's just that I would expect that sensible people would have more of a sense of outrage, and because the first cry when he won the election, and that could be seen as a stolen election, right, with Russian help, was we are not going to normalize this, right? We're not going to normalize that. But it got normalized. And now we're at this stage where I don't think there's a sufficient amount of outrage, even with his supporters. Here's just one thing I'll leave on. In terms of, I have a Black Republican friend, and I remember asking him maybe about a year ago. He's a member of, he's an elected official in the Republican Party. And I said, who do you think is more loyal? Black people to Obama or Trump supporters? And he said, oh, Trump supporters by far. He says, because Black people criticize Obama. Trump supporters will kill you over Trump, literally. And I was like, wow, I've never thought about that. And I said, why there's so many? Because in Ohio, the Republican Party is not as far to the right. They're kind of the sensible Republicans. And I said, why do so many people like support that? Because he's so dissimilar from the cultural attitudes of Ohio Republicans. They said, and he told me they're scared. They don't want to be bullied on his Twitter account, right? They don't want to be isolated. So I started to see that all these big politicians with a lot of egos are scared to death. It's Machiavellian. It's the idea I'd rather be feared than loved, right? I choose to be that fear that he will throw Giuliani under the bus. I heard that, today in the paper it said, I'm not going to pay Giuliani because I got impeached a second time, right? He supposedly called Mike Pence a kitty cat because he wouldn't overturn the results of the election. He tried to browbeat the Georgia Secretary of State, who's a Republican, the CIA guy who was a Republican. I mean, it's such a transactional thing, right, with him, that to me it's just amazing how he gets away with it, and there's not sufficient checks on that. And I don't know, to me, that's just a structural flaw of our democratic system, in the sense that there's an assumption of good faith, right? And everything that, in more kind of elite circles. And he violates that at will all the time, and nobody reins that in. And that to me is the most striking thing.
So let me finish my contribution here by saying that when Bonhoeffer at the end of his life was in prison, in the letters and papers from prison, there's a part where he talks about the book that he wants to write about the future of Christianity, a stock taking of Christianity. And it's a very powerful little small section about, in the midst of total moral collapse, how does Christianity rebuild itself? And he says one of the main questions going forward is, what is it that we really believe enough to the point that we're willing to give our life for it? And if you're willing to give your life for a political ideology or a political ruler, it ain't Jesus that you're following. I'm just going to leave it there.
Yeah, idolatry, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I didn't even touch questions about after the air quotes peaceful transition of power, and how we're going to pressure Biden, and then how in a like where there's not the immediately obvious central power or whatever, what does fidelity look like? Hopefully, in a week or two, we can do this again and talk about those questions. But I want to make sure you both have any opportunity to say closing thoughts. that you have. The one thing I was thinking that, in just looking at the questions that didn't come up, is, um, and there are a number of them related around this, but yes, I think neoliberalism and the way our current economic order has instilled hopelessness in such a large number of people in both political parties that apocalyptic solutions become more attractive. And one of the things that makes me so enthusiastic about Reverend William Barber's work is his insistence that you can't do race or class analysis without the other. And that if you just, like one of the things he emphasized recently, I listened to this interview with him and Cornel West, and they both went back and forth like this just seems obvious, is if we organize in a way where there's 25% higher vote of people that if they voted under our crappy economic support structures, their life was better, then we'd have a radically different like system. And so like there are a number of questions about the relationship of race and class in our contemporary place. I just think it's like thinking forward, that's going to be an important question to ask in the Biden administration, where the performance of identification could be an offer to not address real class antagonism. But I mean, the other side is like there are so many people in this country that don't believe we're in a democracy that they will use the right to vote. That the I think the testimony of Georgia is things can really be different if we're organized and committed and want our communities to thrive. That a very red ass state can give two senators that are going to be on the left side of the Democratic Party. Like that's good news. And like I mean it's not an immediate solution, but it's good news. And so I just feel like in the middle, like don't let Trumpanistas being ridiculous make us forget that last week we were worried that Mitch McConnell was going to be in charge of the Senate and that the future of the planet was going to have to wait 2 years until it's a friendly Democrat Senate one just to pass Don't Kill the Planet 101 bill, right? It's like there has been like the Warnock election is such a huge deal. Anyway, like there are so many questions around the race and class thing that I wanted to raise it, but also just go the on the ground thing. Like Reverend Barber is like a real witness to someone investing in rural white poverty and is a member of the prophetic Black church. And that's a beautiful possibility for us to lean into as people of faith.
Did you want to go or?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Wow. You know, when I did the class this summer, we were kind of observing perhaps the largest interracial movement, grassroots movement in our country's history, the Black Lives Matter movement. Never before have we seen the amount of white people fighting for Black lives in Portland, in places where there are not too many Black people, like Portland, and all throughout the country, even throughout the world. I was, even in Scotland, Tripp was telling me that he was going to a Black Lives Matter rally. I was like, in Scotland? Really? Black people in Scotland? So it was just such an impressive, wide global phenomenon. And then to come to this, right? A kind of reemergence of white supremacy at our capital, that's very disheartening, and seeing how the elections, and it kind of makes us see what's the kind of correlation between our grassroots movement and what we see at the highest halls of power. I think where the church has to go in this historical moment is that it should be take the lead on rituals of repentance, because it has a lot to repent from, right? Repenting from white supremacy, repenting from complicity in empire, right? That's where I think that leadership should go, is first a repentance. And then tomorrow is Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. And then a commitment to realizing beloved community, right? So I think the two things. One is a repentance from this type of inordinate grasp for power and power to dominate, and a kind of deep kind of transformation, and then a recommitment to the ideals of beloved community in terms of the vision that Martin Luther King articulated. And that's not just a kind of static idea, that's an evolving idea that includes not just human beings, but must evolve to include even non-human life on the planet.
Yeah, thanks.
No, I don't have much to offer other than the fact that this summer I was actually looking at Black Lives Matter, and that I felt hope. You know, I was like, okay, well, maybe this is where our hope is going to overcome the moment. But it's precisely in that moment where white supremacy in its latent form becomes fearful. We're not going to be able to control the world anymore. And what was hoped for me was death for them. And I think January the 6th was a manifestation of that fear. Just like on August the 12th, 2017, it was fear that I experienced the most. And so going forward, yeah, there's a lot of repair. And we can talk about that later. I'm not willing to ride Biden's ass at this point. There'll be plenty of time for that later. Right now, for me, I'm waiting for a vaccine. You know, I think a large majority of our country is in pain. They're suffering. They hurt, and they're just waiting for some healing. And that's my prayer right now, is that healing's gonna start to happen, and it will be slow and long and stuff. But you know, you talk about as well off as I am in this society. I was looking at my most recent drug bill, and it was so much money. I was thinking, do I really need this? Do I really need these? You know, there are millions of people in this country right now that can't even feed themselves. And so it's not just a matter of whether or not they need drugs, it's a matter they need food. So maybe that's where we start, feeding the hungry.
Yeah. Well, I just want you both to know that I'm sure I'm partially still sane, partially after lockdown, because I got to hang out with both of you and do these classes and meet lots of cool people on the internet who read along with us and engaged everything. And I'm, as much as fun as that is, I'm also just, optimistic that there were thousands of people that joined the groups and cared to do so. And, that's the optimism I want to lean into, is that there are more, I think there are more and more people in the church that realize, like, being the steward of what we've been handed isn't the only thing on our job description. And there are things to learn from the witness of James Cone and Dietrich Bonhoeffer for this moment. I'm excited about it. And yeah, but thank you both. Like I really would have gone crazy in lockdown. Scotland does real lockdown. I don't know if Americans understand this.
Oh, they do.
Like, we do real lockdown. Now, granted, y'all would have had 200,000 less deaths if your death rate was what Scotland's was, but you would had to have spent a lot of time with just a few people. And
one of my best friends is in London right now.
The
Same
English
thing.
though, their ratio is not the same though. the Scottish like to brag about how much more successful we've been with COVID than the British, because when we were told not to go drinking till 2 a.m, we did. But the English, they don't know how to drink alone in their homes. Scottish, they said, we've been practicing forever. We invented the Highlands. I'd heard that from so many Scottish guys. I was like, I get what you're saying. But anyway.
All right.
But thank you both tons. It's been a blast. Yep. And once things transition, we'll have to get to the second half of the questions after we get shots and a new president.
Yeah. So we have my wife and I cheeseburger sliders, red, white, and blue potato salad, apple pie, and champagne on the menu, coleslaw on the menu for Wednesday. But I have to say, after last week, it's not going to be as celebratory as it was, because something broke last week in this culture, in this society, and I don't know if it can be repaired.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I thought that the loss of the election would be like blowing up the Death Star, but that thing is trying to reconstitute in a new way. And that's what's pretty, I guess, evil and wrongness is very persistent and very recalcitrant in our body politic. And we have to find a way to form a contrast society, right? Form contrast communities in ways that can show, that can put a different witness in the world.
No, that's a great image. And of course, you can always destroy the Death Star a second time, find out later the Emperor was never really dead. And you just hope for the mini eschaton called the Mandalorian. That's always an option.
I forgot talking to a Star Wars junkie here.
This is the way.
This is the way. Y'all have a great night.
May the force be with you.
And also with you.
Right.
This is the way.
So say we all.
All right.